Who's going to stop the fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan? Yes, there have been periodic flare-ups since the mid-1990s and that brutal border war that accompanied the breakup of the Soviet Union in Nagorno-Karabakh. But why does the fighting of that mostly Armenian-speaking separatist enclave seem so much more intense this time? France 24's teams are on both sides. You'll hear them in this show. Adding to the sense that it's different this time is Turkey's strong backing for Baku. Is Ankara all in on Azerbaijan's side, or staking a claim as power broker in a region of the Caucasus that up to now was always, it seemed, exclusively Russia's turf? Both Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin are in each other's paths, by the way, on several fronts: Syria, Libya, and now Nagorno-Karabakh. What's Moscow's next move, particularly when it's also got fires burning to its west in Belarus and now further east in Kyrgyzstan? More broadly, how can Armenia and Azerbaijan avoid it from getting much worse, which it most certainly can? Today in the France 24 debate, how to stop the fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh. Joining us from the Azerbaijan capital, Baku, France 24 senior correspondent, Catherine Norris-Trent. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Francois.
From Yerevan, France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg is reporting. How are you, Gulliver?
Good, thanks. Good to be on the show.
Also in the Armenian capital is Armen Grigorian, professor of international relations at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And from Istanbul, freelance Azerbaijani journalist Arzu Gebula. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, both sides again claiming this Wednesday that civilians are under attack in Nagorno-Karabakh's largest city, Stepanakert. Evidence of more shelling, as we can see in these images. Same story on the other side of the front line. Let's take a look at the report that you, Catherine Norris-Trent, filed earlier.
A few kilometers from the front line, artillery rocks the Azeri countryside. Every day, these villagers gather to watch the battle from a hilltop. It's the same expression of national pride we hear everywhere in a country which prepares its children for war. One of the men invites us to his home, complete with a hastily built bomb shelter.
Bu bizim sığanaqda, atıb eləyəndə giririk bura, özümüzü qoruyuruq. Ailə burada, ay uşaq burada, anam burada, bacım burada yerləşir. Sakitləşəndə çıxırıq, gedirik evə.
That loud detonation indicates Azerbaijan's armed forces are firing from nearby. But despite the danger, some are refusing to flee, including this woman who's 97 years old. In the largest nearby town, people tell us business is bad, with many customers staying off the streets. But in this bakery, the ovens are full, and the staff are working flat out.
Əhaliyə, bütün əhaliyə xidmətə, bir də cəbhəyə. Əskərlərimizə.
Pişirməklə, verməklə, bir ana kimi, bir xala kimi özümüzdə bir yüngüllük tapırıq. Öyle bir boş bilirik onu.
On camera, no one here expresses any doubts or fear.
Now, Catherine, the Azeri foreign minister is going to be in Geneva on Thursday. It could be the first daylight for those trying to broker peace talks. He's due to meet with the OSCE Minsk group co-chairs and present his country's position. We'll talk more about diplomacy later. But first, let me ask you, really, why is it when you're there, what's the sense of why the fighting this time is so much more intense?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Francois, because I haven't been to Azerbaijan before. It's rare for us to get journalistic access, so I don't have elements to compare this to. But what I can tell you is the people we speak to, while we're accompanied, I should say, by an official minder at all times, the people we speak to seem extremely fired up over this. It's incredibly emotional. There's a real sense that this time they want the Azeri army to go in and take back what many of the people in the border area have told us. They call it their motherland. We've been speaking to people who told us that they had to move out of Nagorno-Karabakh some 30 years ago when this conflict first erupted, and that they still hope now to return to their homes. So there's an awful lot of nationalistic sentiment, a lot of pride here. And I think it's got, it's gone so far now that for a lot of people I've been speaking to near the border area, honestly, they want the war to continue. That's what they tell us at any rate. So they're saying that if it stopped now, I think there'd be quite a lot of anger and incomprehension among some of those people. They're kind of cheering the soldiers on. We spoke to people living in a village that was nearly coming under fire, not far from the front lines, where the army was staking out positions in that residential area, and it was incredibly dangerous for them, but they still didn't want to leave.
Still didn't want to leave, and that sentiment that you describe, it runs across all generations?
From the people we've been speaking to, again, Francois, so again, I just want to state the conditions which we're working under. It is extremely complicated here to cover. But from people we've been meeting to, you saw that 97-year-old woman in our report saying she would never leave her home, never be driven out. Children, we went to one school where there were photos of recent flare-ups of tensions in Nagorno-Karabakh from 2016. All across the walls of the corridors of the school, pictures of the president, pictures of missiles being fired. This is something that is educated, that is told to children from a very early age. It's difficult to state, I think, how much an issue of national pride it is for some of the people here.
All right, that's on the Azerbaijani side. France 24 followed one Armenian who fought in the war that started just before the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Gulliver Cragg, who followed him upon his return there.
Vardan works as a builder in western France. He's come to Paris to fly to his native Armenia and join the fight for Nagorno-Karabakh. His sons are here to see him off.
Évidemment, c'est notre héros.
A veteran of the First Karabakh War in the 1990s, the 45-year-old plans to return to his hometown, form a group of volunteers and head to the front. By the time he arrives, 2 men from Yeghvad have already been killed in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Կեցե հայոց հաղթական բանակը, կեցե հայ կամավորականի ոչին։ Մենք հաղթելու ենք, հաղթելու ենք միանշանակ։ Դու կանես հավաքեք։ Հաղթանակը մերն է։
Vardan has not yet received authorization to join the armed forces. He remains at the funeral of his friend Vatik. The fallen soldier, who was 35, is taken to the capital to be buried. There are funerals from morning till night these days at the Heroes Cemetery in Yerevan, more than one at a time. deaths that seem to be only reinforcing Armenians' determination not to give up.
Well, again, Gulliver Cragg joins us live now from the Armenian capital, Yerevan. Gulliver, you heard Catherine Norris-Trent describe the determination on the Azerbaijan side. Judging from that report, it's a zero-sum game.
Yes, I think that determination is absolutely matched on the Armenian side. I mean, you saw in our report, those guys were leaving in the direction of the front line straight from the funeral of the other son of that town, Yegvad, who had already been killed during the first week of fighting, and there were two of them who were killed. There is a great sense of a nation coming together at the moment in Armenia. Certainly Armenians view it as Armenia itself that is under attack. It's not just the people of Nagorno-Karabakh that they feel that they have to defend. The government's line, with the Prime Minister in particular pushing this very strongly, is that Turkey, in its support for Azerbaijan in this conflict, has got Armenia in its sights. Armenians, of course, still never having been in any way reconciled with Turkey since the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Empire in 1915, which Turkey has never recognized as such. There is a huge amount of suspicion of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's intentions and a real sense that this is a battle to defend the country. I mean, clearly, on either side of this conflict, ordinary people view it in a completely different way.
And viewed in a completely different way. And just 24 hours ago, Gulliver, you were telling us how there's those inside of Armenia who are urging for the recognition of that separatist enclave as an independent state.
Yes, today we spoke to a diplomat from the de facto authorities of Nagorno-Karabakh who was really pushing for the international community, and including presumably Armenia itself, to recognize the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh. But he also explained why Armenia does not do this, because it does not want to be officially at war with Azerbaijan, and it does not want to officially tear up the Madrid Principles, which is one of the roadmaps to peace that are supposedly still on the table and that mean that Nagorno-Karabakh's eventual status should be decided by referendum. But the Prime Minister and the President of Armenia have increasingly vocally been talking about the idea that maybe it's time for Armenia to recognize the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh, which it does not formally do. No country does. And of course, if Armenia did that, it would then be pushing for other countries around the world to follow suit.
Armin Grigorian is currently in this. We've just set the mood the way it is. Would you say that this is something that could really happen, or is this just posturing?
I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to. What could happen?
That Armenia could recognize the separatist enclave as an independent state.
I don't think it is going to happen. I think it will be a very radical move. And although there are arguments in favor of it, in the sense that Armenia in that case will acquire the opportunity to officially sign a defense alliance with the Nagorno-Karabakh and provide it military assistance overtly. But I think there are factors that make such recognition, in my view, a bad idea, and it is premature even now. So one of the arguments has been that if we recognize it now, it will cause war, and people in favor of recognition are arguing that there is already a war. What's the point of not recognizing? But I think the recognition now will be not only an act against Azerbaijan, it will be an act against other states, including the Minsk group mediators, including Armenia's ally Russia, which is not in favor of such recognition.
Why is it that we've had this worst flare-up since 1994 right now?
Now, your correspondence referred to the nationalist fervor, which is clearly visible both in Azerbaijan and Armenia. The nationalist fervor, however, has been there, and kind of the uncompromising positions and kind of the zero-sum attitude toward toward the solution to the Karabakh problem has always been there. So the question one has to ask is what changed recently. And there are two things that I think we should look at, two factors that have been different from before. One was the change of power in Armenia and the perception it may have created in Azerbaijan that it might have somehow shaken the coherence of the Armenian state, or more importantly, there may have been a perception that this government's relationship with Russia is not as good as the previous governments have had, and that may give Azerbaijan some kind of a window of opportunity. I don't think that was the main factor, however, and that that perception was certainly exaggerated. I think the main factor was something that you referred to in your introduction, which was the dramatic shift in Turkey's foreign policy in general over the last few years and toward the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict in particular. And this may have created a sense or a perception of a window of opportunity in Azerbaijan that now is the time to attack, since they have Turkey's almost unconditional backing and military support. And one other related factor could be the improved relations between Russia and Turkey also over the last several years. You referred to some conflicts that Russia and Turkey have, but it is also true that Russia and Turkey have significantly improved their relations, especially as Turkey has had certain disputes and conflict with its Western allies.
Well, let me just because we have to go to the break soon. We'll get back to that point afterwards. But let me just bring in Arzu Gebula very quickly before we go to that break. Arzu, do you agree that Turkey is such a major factor in all of this that Azerbaijan feels emboldened?
Well, I think Turkey's involvement in this conflict has certainly boosted Azerbaijan's confidence. And, it's not surprising that this is happening, but it's surprising why it's happening now, because the conflict has been going on for, as it was mentioned, for a really long time. And Turkey was always on the side of the escalation, or at least in recent years, it was always on the side of de-escalation. So having this kind of support from Turkey this time, especially after the July escalation, is clearly giving the morale, as the government claims at this point in time, for Azerbaijani army to push forward.
Arzu, I want to go back over that timeline that you mentioned because it's so key. We have to take a quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we are looking at the fiercest fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh since the end of the civil war in 1994. I say the end of the civil war, but no peace treaty has ever been signed, although there were attempts just last year to come to some sort of final agreement. There were summits held between the two countries. We're talking about it from Baku. France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent, senior correspondent, is covering it from that side of the front line. And the other side is France 24 correspondent Gulliver Craig, who's in the Armenian capital. Also in Yerevan, Armin Grigorian, professor of international relations at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania in the United States. And in Istanbul, freelance Azerbaijani journalist Arzu Gebula. Arzu, just before the break, you were mentioning how you had this flare-up in July at the borders. There were border skirmishes. They were quite serious. And then we have a lull, and then suddenly it all erupts. Why?
Well, I think it's really important to note that the July skirmishes, the July escalation was happening not just on the front line, but it was on the border, the internationally recognized border. And also the fact that during those skirmishes, one high-ranking general from Azerbaijan was killed in combat. And this is the first sort of that kind of death in the history of the conflict since the ceasefire was signed. And I think that was a trigger for much of what we're seeing now. Many people went on the streets. This was the middle of the pandemic, middle of the summer. There were curfews imposed, and yet 30,000 people went on the city's main square and protested in front of the parliament, demanding that President Ilham Aliyev actually goes into war and seeks justice for what was done to the general, but also in general for what was going on. So we need to take that into account, that particular element. And then in the course of the following months, there was this ongoing exchange between Turkey. There was a military training between Turkish and Azerbaijani armed forces, a joint training. And so there was a preparation. There was a preparation. It was just not clear when it was going to explode as it has on September 27th. Perhaps there are a number of factors to this, and one of the factors that are being mentioned by several analysts up until now is this disengagement that we're seeing on the side of the U.S., but also on the European side. They're pushing Nagorno-Karabakh conflict on the side. It's been dragging for this long. There won't be a peaceful resolution to it. Complete disengagement, and then this growing frustration on the side of the government of Azerbaijan with the negotiation process. And that's why they've been pushing the Madrid principles and the whole negotiation process on the sidelines and saying, well, if we haven't reached a common ground during the last 26 years, then we're going to get what is rightfully ours by military intervention. So again, as I said, it was a matter of an event, an explosion that would trigger this intervention.
Would trigger this intervention, and the fact that we have news that the Azeri foreign minister is traveling to Geneva on Thursday, could that bring hope of a de-escalation?
I very much hope so. As a journalist covering this conflict, seeing that this is the longest conflict that we've seen since the ceasefire. It's longer than the 4-day war that we saw in April 2016. The fact that he's traveling to Geneva to meet with the co-chairs is a really hopeful sign. But I'm also hearing that this is not happening for Prime Minister Pashinyan, that he will actually be traveling to Moscow on October 12th. And so it's going to be an interesting timeline to watch for. I just really hope that it's definitely a sign towards at least some light at the end of the tunnel.
All right. And we mentioned in part one of our discussion the fact that Turkey this time has gone all in. Let's listen to his foreign minister when he spoke in Baku, Azerbaijan's capital, on Tuesday.
Ateşkes olsun da sonuç ne olacak? Ermenistan'a derhal Azerbaycan'ın topraklarından çekil diyebiliyor musunuz? Veya çekilmesi için bir çözüm üretebiliyor musunuz? Hayır.
Effectively there, Catherine Norris-Trent saying a ceasefire, well, that won't get us anywhere at this point. What's the feeling regarding Turkey where you are?
Oh, there's an awful lot of pro-Turkish support here. I mean, but that's historical in many ways as well. But right now, around the streets of Baku, there are many Azeri flags flying from windows, shops, cars. More than usual, we're told, but also many Turkish flags, and people we meet telling us they're incredibly grateful for Turkish support. So yeah, a feeling there that they've got a powerful ally coming to stand behind them. And I think it's quite reassuring for a lot of the population here. We've been speaking with Azeri government officials in briefings, trying to sit down and understand their point of view. And they insist they're not being helped physically, militarily by Turkey, even they pushed on that point. But they say that Turkey is ready to intervene, possibly, if it gets to that stage. I have to say, when I was a bit nearer the front lines earlier on today, and we saw overhead quite a large drone. So we don't know whether the Turkish president has admitted that they are using Turkish-made drones. So there's a lot of lack of clarity, really, about Turkey's exact role here. But it's certainly seen as a boost by a lot of the population, we can say that.
France 24 has been reporting on those mercenaries coming from Syria, paid between 1,300 and 2,000 euros a month to fight on the Azerbaijan side. Has there been any talk of that where you are?
Well, you know, I've asked people about this and officials, and they absolutely flat out deny it. And you say, look, but what about social media videos and geolocalization? And they say, no such videos exist. It's kind of like you've got the mirror image of what is being said from one side of this conflict to the other, I think. They say, no, there are mercenaries fighting from Syria and Lebanon on the Armenian side. So, you know, it's very confusing. It is also a communications war. There's information, disinformation. It's all very, very difficult to, of course, to verify independently. But yeah, flat out denials on that officially from here in Baku.
All right, we heard earlier Arzu Gebula hoping that that trip by Azerbaijan's foreign minister to Geneva could be the starting point to some de-escalation, but we also heard her say, wondering why Armenia's prime minister so far is not announced. Perhaps we missed it, but so far it doesn't seem like it in Geneva, rather in Moscow. Now, Vladimir Putin this Wednesday pouring cold water on a fresh call by Nikol Pashinyan, Armenia's prime minister, for Russia to trigger its mutual defense agreements with Yerevan.
У нас перед Арменией есть определенные обязательства в рамках этого договора, но боевые действия, к огромному нашему сожалению, они продолжаются до сих пор, они ведутся не на территории Армении. Что же касается исполнения Россией своих договорных обязательств в рамках этого договора, то мы всегда исполняли, исполняем и будем исполнять свои обязательства.
So there you have it, Gulliver Craig, that key sentence in what we heard from Vladimir Putin. The hostilities are not taking place on the territory of Armenia.
Yes, and we note that it took until today for Vladimir Putin to say anything publicly on the subject of this conflict. He says that there is no reason for the defense pact that Russia has with Armenia to be triggered so far because Nagorno-Karabakh is not part of Armenia. It's not recognized by Armenia or by Russia, and the defense pact concerns Armenia. But in so doing, Vladimir Putin did also reiterate that Russia is committed to this defense pact and that if Armenia proper is attacked, then Russia would intervene, which does somewhat pour cold water on the kinds of things that Nikol Pashinyan has been saying about how far Turkey might go, which very much seems to be implying that Nikol Pashinyan and the Armenian leadership think that an attack on Armenia is possible. In theory, according to what Vladimir Putin has been saying and according to the text of the defense agreement between Russia and Armenia, that would definitely mean that Russia would intervene. And I think we can be reasonably confident in thinking that that would mean Turkey would not go that far.
And just to remind our viewers, Russia, which has military bases in Armenia.
Russia has a very important military base, yes, in the west of Armenia, in the city of Gyumri.
But at the same time sells weapons to both sides.
That's right. Well, for analysts for many years have been saying that Russia has been sort of playing this conflict as a way of keeping these two countries unstable, keeping Armenia in particular from really being able to develop better relations with the West, and also making good money out of selling arms to the Azeris, who did, though, at least in the past, accuse Russia of selling less good quality weapons to them than to Armenia. I mean, it's a very strange situation, really, for Russia's position in this whole conflict now, because Russia's ally traditionally and officially is Armenia. But at the same time, Armenia 2.5 years ago had a popular pro-democratic uprising that overturned the old guard and brought Nikol Pashinyan, the current prime minister, to power on a wave of euphoria. And Vladimir Putin is reportedly not very keen on those kinds of pro-democratic uprisings. He's not thought to want to see them be successful. And one wonders how he feels about Armenia at the moment, in the light in particular of what's going on in Belarus and perhaps also in Kyrgyzstan. And perhaps he is not as inclined to help an Armenia that is governed by a government that came to power on the back of a pro-democratic uprising than he might have been to help Armenia when it was governed by the previous pre-revolutionary administration.
Yeah, Armin Grigorian, Moscow's got a lot of fires on its doorstep. You've just heard Gulliver Craig mention them. There's what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh. There is Belarus. Now there's Kyrgyzstan, where parliament's been dissolved after street protests. And I'm not even mentioning the prospect of sanctions by the EU against Moscow over the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. So how much attention are Armenians expecting from the Kremlin to this conflict?
Obviously, Armenians would have preferred Russia not to have these problems and to have all of its attention available to this conflict. But even with Russia being partially distracted with these other problems, I think I agree with Gulliver that in case of any prospect of Turkish intervention and transfer of that conflict to Armenian territory or involvement of Armenia proper in the war is going to bring in Russia. And it is not just a matter of Russia's legal obligation as part of the treaty. I cannot imagine Russia tolerating such an intervention.
You made it sound earlier, Armin, a little bit like Vladimir Putin almost eyes Recep Tayyip Erdogan as a better friend than Nikol Pashinyan?
No, I didn't suggest that by any means.
Okay.
But what I said was that in recent years, despite the many problems and disputes and conflicts of interest that Turkey and Russia have and have had traditionally, there has been a degree of rapprochement between the two countries. And this has been a process that has taken place simultaneously with the kind of distance that has been created between Turkey and the West. So I'm not walking back on that statement. I think that is a process that has been important and has had important implications for regional politics. However, it's one thing to say that, it's a totally different thing to predict that in case of a Turkish intervention, Russia might stand back. Moreover, whatever their common interests are in other areas, they also have disputes and disagreements and divergent preferences on a number of issues. And I think the preferences on a Turkish intervention in the Caucasus would definitely diverge, and Russia would not tolerate that.
So your thoughts, you're the only one I haven't put the question to here, on the Azeri foreign minister's trip Thursday to Geneva.
I think it's a hopeful sign. In fact, I have noticed a mild move toward more moderate rhetoric on both sides, which may have been a function of the situation on the front. I think Armenia has sustained, it's been very difficult for the Armenian side. It has been in some ways an unequal fight, but the Armenian lines have held, and the Armenian armed forces the Karabakh armed forces have performed very well. Whatever successes Azerbaijan may have scored, I think they fall well short of what their expectations may have been, especially given the tremendous numerical and technological advantages that Azerbaijan has had. And as a result of the situation on the front line, which has not lived up to the expectations of the Azerbaijani leadership, because it has also been quite costly for the Armenian side, I think both sides will slowly be moving toward more moderation and toward talks about a ceasefire. I'm not predicting that it will end any hour now. The fighting may continue, and Armenians and Azerbaijanis may need some mediation and some convincing to stop fighting. But I think it is definitely true that the rhetoric has undergone some softening over the last 24 hours or so.
I want to pick up on that point, but first let me turn to Catherine Norris-Trent. You mentioned earlier that you were near the front lines. Did you get a sense, because listening there to Armin Grigorian, we're after 11 days already almost at a stalemate position here. Did you get a sense that of a lessening of the fighting? Obviously, I know what I'm asking you is for anecdotal evidence here.
Yeah, well, one anecdote that I think perhaps is quite telling, that we were speaking with officials here and they were saying perhaps we were going to get permission to accompany the Azeri army out to a few villages that they said they'd retaken from Nagorno-Karabakh. So we got prepared for that, got the flak jackets on, got in the car, you know, a whole convoy of journalists. And we got to the base from where we were going to be briefed and it was suddenly called off. And they said it was still too dangerous, there was still too much shelling. They'd said that these were villages that they had confirmed as having taken. They said they'd had time to demine them. Now, I don't know the facts on the ground because we never actually went there. But the fact that they changed plan, I mean, I don't know if we can read anything into that perhaps it's more complicated. That would seem to fit in with that. More complicated than perhaps they'd imagined in order to advance. Although officially they tell us they're advancing well and they're retaking territory. You know, we've had several announcements from the Azeri president on that.
Gulliver Crag, our viewers get confused when they look at the diplomacy of all this. You guys talk about a Madrid process. There's this three-country approach to brokering any kind of a deal between Russia, France, and the United States. So on the one hand, the Russians and the French are on the same page officially when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh. On the other, we've just had a statement from the Kremlin slamming as unacceptable French and German allegations on Alexei Navalny. These are kind of parallel universes that never cross?
I mean, I guess that the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh is a little bit of an exceptional issue in terms of France's relations with Russia compared to other issues, because on the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, they are closer to being on the same page than they are on questions of things like the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. But obviously those things don't help the general atmosphere of relations between Paris and Moscow. And I think at the moment, actually, Paris's relations with Ankara are arguably worse than Moscow's. Emmanuel Macron has been one of the most vocal international leaders in terms of criticizing Turkey's policy here in the Caucasus, and that is something that has absolutely not gone unnoticed by the Armenian people. When we meet people and they say they see that we're from a French media, we often hear words of appreciation for Emmanuel Macron's strong criticism of Turkey.
Arzu Gebula, is France the right mediator to have, again, if they're at cross swords right now with Turkey over other issues, Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean? Who should be the honest broker in all of this?
I mean, I'm not sure France is the right mediator unless France steps in with other mediators like Germany, for instance. But especially after Macron's criticism of Turkey, his reputation, we're seeing in Azerbaijan the total opposite of how he's being welcomed in Armenia. In Azerbaijan, certainly there's a lot of criticism. And so here in Turkey as well, to the statements of Macron on the Turkish involvement in this current conflict, on Turkey's involvement in this current conflict. So when we're talking about mediators, I mean, one of the things that is mentioned over and over again is that the structure itself needs to change, because even after the sides do return, if they return to the negotiation table, there's obviously a very different playing field with the developments on the front line that we've seen in the last, 11 days now. So with the changing situation, obviously there will be need for a different kind of deal, whether it's going to be formally discussed, return of the 5 territories and then negotiation over the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, or there's going to be a different proposal on the table with different actors involved. And in this particular case, Azerbaijan really wants to see Turkey as part of the mediator, as part of the group that will be mediating this conflict. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this is going to structure, especially in the context of countries involved. But if there's one country that Azerbaijan is not really pleased right now with, it's France, and they're more leaning towards having countries like Germany, for instance, and especially Turkey involved in the negotiations.
And before we go, Arzu Gebelu, what happened after that 2018 so-called Velvet Revolution in Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan becomes prime minister. There are a series of summits with President Aliyev. At the time, there seemed like maybe there could be a peace deal. What happened?
Well, I think that's $1 million of what happened. But that could be said about all the previous meetings between the leaders of the two countries before Pashinyan and after Pashinyan became the prime minister, because what we are seeing from the meetings is very different than what we're getting back in the country, because when the leaders return to their respective countries, the rhetoric goes back to the sort of heated nationalistic speech of talking about returning the territories and what is rightfully ours. And in this particular case, because we haven't really seen the content of these discussions, of the so-called possible resolutions, it's really hard to say what went wrong. But I think it's fair to say that perhaps what Azerbaijan was demanding from the very beginning was not something that Prime Minister Pashinyan could have agreed to. And this is especially visible now in this 11-day war, when the government of Azerbaijan repeated over and over its demands. And of course, one of the first demands is the return of the occupied territories, the 7 adjacent territories.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. So much more to talk about, but I want to thank you so much, Arzu Gebila, for joining us from Istanbul. I want to thank as well Armin Grigorian for being with us from Yerevan, also in the Armenian capital, France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg, and in Baku, capital of Azerbaijan, Catherine Norris Trent. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.